Hello, everyone. Welcome to 511 Day 2. Our goals today are the same as yesterday. It's just another round of essentially being able to find the inverse of a function using that verbal description and learning how to undo the things that a function does to a number. All right, so we want to learn how to continue to learn how to verbally describe what a function does. We're going to see some different types of functions today that might be a little bit harder to verbally describe. So I'm going to go through some of those. And then we're going to learn how to undo those and find the inverse so that we have that inverse function. All right. So let's take a look here at our first equation or our first function. We have f of x, and I'm looking at this thing. I see a square root. We see some addition and subtraction, a little bit of multiplication going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and try and describe what this function does in words here. So I'm going to start off first bullet point. So when we see a square root, you got to treat that kind of like a parenthesis. So when you're thinking about your order of operations, if you ever have a function with a square root or a cube root, go inside of that first to find the first thing that's been done to the x. And so if I'm inside of the square root, I see this minus 1. Okay, so that is the first thing that was done. So I'm going to say minus 1, or actually I should say subtract 1. I say one thing, my brain's thinking another. So we're going to say subtract 1. Okay, and then the second thing, right, is the square root, right? So there's nothing else done inside of the square root. So the next thing that was done after I subtracted 1, we square root. So I'm going to write that down. So we square root. And then after we square root, the next thing we did to the number was we multiplied by 3. So I'm going to say multiply by 3. And then the last thing done was this addition of 2 on the end. Okay, I think it's kind of the hardest part, with these types of problems is just figuring out what order things were done in. And with order of operations, like you remember PEMDAS, like parentheses, exponents, but it doesn't really cover like situations like this, like where does square root fall in? And later on in math, you'll learn that a square root is kind of like an exponent. So it falls in the E part of PEMDAS. All right, so now we're going to undo. So remember, to undo, we start with the last thing and we undo going backwards. Okay, so we start down here with the addition of 2. We're going to undo that and then work our way backwards through these steps. So the opposite of adding 2 is to subtract 2. So if I want to undo, the first thing I have to do is subtract 2. And then I'm going to go up here multiplying by 3. So I want to undo that multiplication of 3. That means I need to divide by 3. And then I want to undo a square root. So I have to think about, well, what's the opposite of square rooting? And that is squaring, right? Squaring and square rooting are opposite operations, right? So if we square root, the opposite is square. If we square, the opposite is square root. Okay, so those two are linked, all right? So if you ever see a square, you square root. Like I said, if you ever see a square root in a function, you're going to square. All right, so subtract 1 is the last thing that we need to undo, so we're going to add 1. And now I need to write this as a function, right? So I'm going to write this undoing function, and I'm going to name it f inverse of x. Remember that notation we talked about yesterday, right? So we're going to say f inverse of x equals, and then I can just write it down here, right? Because I'm kind of confined by this box, right? So I'm just going to write my x, right? And the first thing I need to do to it is subtract 2. There we go. Then we need to divide by 3. Done. Then we got to square it, right? So I'm going to put this whole expression that I have so far in the parentheses, right? So the whole thing goes in the parentheses, and I'm going to square it. All right, a very common mistake that students will make is they'll only square the top. All right, you need to square that whole fraction. Okay, and then the last thing I got to do here is add 1. So I'm just going to go outside the parentheses and put a plus 1. And there's my function. All right, so this would be the inverse function of this. So if I drop a number in here and do stuff to it, I can undo all that stuff by putting the output back in the inverse here. Okay. Let's try it again. This time going the other direction. Here they give me the function in words, right? They're telling me what the function does in words. So I need to write it in its symbolic form, and then we'll work on the undo function. Okay, so we're going to go over here. I'm going to write my x, right? That's my input, and I'm going to add 1 to the input. right? So plus 1, and then I'm going to cube root. Now this is a new one, right? So I think we saw cube root in the video from yesterday, but it looks just like a square root. So it looks like this, but with a little 3 on it, right? So that makes it a cube root. And then we're going to multiply by 5, right? So if I want to multiply by 5, I can put a 5 out front, just put a little multiplication symbol in front of it, right? So 5 times the cube root of x plus 1. And then the last thing here is we need to subtract 3. So I'm just going to put that on the end, making sure it's not inside of the cube root. It's going to be on the outside. And that completes my function for f of x, right? So this is the function that's going to do something to my number. Now I want to undo all this stuff that I just did, right? So I start with the last thing. That was the last thing I did was I subtracted 3. So the first thing I'm going to do in my undo function is I'm going to add 3. Okay. Then I go back here, multiply it by 5. So undo multiplication of 5, we divide by 5. Go. Then we need the opposite of cube rooting. Cube rooting. Well, just like with the square and the square root, the opposite of cube rooting is just cubing. Right, that means raising to the power of 3, right? So we're going to cube, and then we're going to subtract 1, right? That would be the opposite of adding 1. So we're going to subtract 1. Okay, and then I'm going to name my function, right? So remember, using the good notation, using correct mathematical notation, we would use this f with the negative 1. The negative 1 indicates that this is an inverse that I'm about to write, and then I have the name of my function, right? F is the name of my function. The negative 1 indicates that it's an inverse of f, and x is the input. So here we go. So I'm going to say, here's my input. I'm going to add 3. I'm going to divide by 5. I'm going to cube it. And then I'm going to subtract 1. There we go. There's my inverse function. This will undo this. All right. Let's do one more. Make sure we got this down. Again, different type of function. So we've seen things with square roots, cube roots, and now we're going to start a function that has a cubing operation. So when we say we cube something, this is what that means. We raise it to the power of 3. Okay. But I do see parentheses, so I'm thinking about that order of operations. And I see some stuff in the parentheses, so x is having 2 added to it, so that's the first thing that I'm going to write down. I'm going to say add 2, and then exponents, right, PEM, right, if we're thinking about our order of operations, I have my exponent of 3, so I'm going to say cube, right, which means raised to the power of 3. And then I'm thinking I've got a division by 3 and a subtraction of 2. Well, division comes first, so we're going to say divide by 3. And then we'll say subtract 2. So this is like the instruction manual for this function, right? This is in English what you're doing to x, all right? Now we want to undo all this stuff, right? So I start with the last thing, that's subtract 2, and I undo it first. So I'm going to add 2. And then I'm going to multiply by 3, right, because I'm working my way backwards. So I'm going to go to the divide by 3, and I'm going to multiply by 3. And then the opposite of cubing is cube root. And then the opposite of adding 2 is subtracting 2. So there we go. So now I've got my instruction manual for the undo function or the inverse function. So let's get that set up. Notice my function here is named h. So when I write my inverse function, I'm going to say h inverse of x, right? So that negative 1 makes it an inverse. And I'm going to write my input. There's my x, and I'm going to do this stuff to it. So I'm going to say add 2, multiply by 3. Okay, so I'm going to put this whole thing in parentheses, and then I'm going to multiply by 3. And then it wants me to cube root. So remember, that looks just like a square root with a little 3. And then it wants me to subtract 2. There we go. All right, so just subtract a 2 on the end, making sure not to put it in the cube root. That would not go inside the cube root. You would cube root first, then subtract 2. So you want that minus 2 on the outside. Okay. All right, guys, hopefully those examples helped you out. Give the practice problems a try, and make sure you let me know if you have questions in the Zoom chat. Good luck, guys.